be finding Matthew chapter 5. We'll begin at verse 27. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. The dictionary says that integrity is the steadfast adherence to a strict moral or ethical code. Now, that virtue of integrity is a problem not only in our country, but all over the world. It's so widespread. From people who are involved in business transactions, there's a lack of integrity. To relationships that we have, there's a lack of integrity. To even the Church of Jesus Christ, we can find problems because of lack of integrity exist. And in these next few teachings, where we are examining the world's greatest sermon preached by the world's greatest preacher, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he's going to deal with three specific issues of integrity. Areas where there should be no question as to what our strict moral and ethical code is, because it's laid down very plainly in God's Word over and over. So we're going to deal with the integrity of the marriage relationship. We're going to deal with the integrity of keeping our word. And tonight, we're going to talk about integrity regarding our sexual conduct specifically. Now, we need to keep in mind that Jesus has a formula in his teaching here. He first states the law as people knew it, the law that was given years ago. He would say something like this: "You have heard that our ancestors were told." And then he fulfills the law by explaining God's intent in giving of the law, what he intended the law to accomplish. And he usually does that by saying something like, "But I say," with the emphasis on I. And each time he goes beyond the physical act to the motive, to the reason. He makes the demands of keeping the law much more difficult. Now, we saw last time that if you hadn't murdered anyone, then you had kept the letter of the law. But if you had devalued human life in any way, by calling people names, or hating someone, or having an unresolved dispute, or holding a grudge, then you had crossed the barrier of God's original intent of the commandment. You had not killed anyone, you had not murdered anyone, but you had still violated the spirit of the law, God's intent in giving the law. And so tonight, let's look at Jesus' explanation, his fulfillment of the law concerning adultery. And we need to say that these are words that the world needs to hear, because it surely seems that stepping outside marriage for sexual gratification is the order of the day. We read about it in magazines and books, and we hear about it on the news, and we see it depicted on television shows and in the movies, and we know the people who have been unfaithful in their marriages, and we also know the terrible consequences that it brings. And it surely seems that today, in our culture, the world has smoothed out the rough, nasty edges of adultery and made it somewhat acceptable. But God's Word says otherwise. And I'll say this again, there are lots up for interpretation in the Bible. There are a lot of things that we can discuss and argue about and have different views on, but not God's moral code. The right and wrong that was established in God's Word still stands, and it remains as God's expectation of his creations, even today, and it always will. So let's begin this teaching by looking at the law stated. In verse 27, Jesus said, you have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. Now, the devout Jews, particularly the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they took the law very seriously. They took this law very seriously, but they had their own definition. They had fine-tuned it down to their own definition of adultery. And surely their definition was limited only to the letter of the law, the physical act, which probably only included sexual intercourse. Any other kind of sexual activity was probably not included in their definition of adultery. Fine-tuning. Yes, that was the habit of the teachers of the law. You remember what they did to the Sabbath. God just put down a commandment to honor the Sabbath, but they turned it into hundreds of rules and regulations, do's and don'ts for the Sabbath. For the teachers of the law, regarding this law, they had gone even beyond fine tuning, way beyond the letter of the law in their interpretation, and it was an interpretation that allowed a lot of adulterers off the hook. These very religious and respected men, their definition of adultery was limited to sexual intercourse between a Jewish married man and the wife of another Jewish man. Sexual relations between a Jewish married man and an unmarried Jewish girl, or the wife of a Gentile, or even sexual relations with a prostitute, there might have been some prohibition, but it was not considered adultery. You see, their interpretation had very little to do with morality. It surely had nothing to do with the sanctity or the value of human life. It had to do with property rights. A wife was considered a man's property, and to have sex with another Jewish man's wife, his property, was equal to stealing from him. So they didn't care about a Gentile's property or the wife of a Gentile man, and to go even further, a single woman was nobody's property. And so here Jesus has stated the Mosaic Law, one of the 10 Commandments. And at this point in our discussion, let's just consider the letter of the law, the physical act that was forbidden when the law was given. And when the law was given, adultery was addressed. And as I've mentioned, it's not considered a major sin by the world today, unless you might be running for political office and another political party finds out about it, or if you have a multi-million-dollar coaching job at a major university in the Bible Belt, well, then maybe it is considered a big sin. Adultery, although it is rarely referred to as adultery today, is a theme that's woven throughout most all media. But the seriousness of adultery has been watered down, particularly in our generation. We see it, we read about it, we know people caught up in it, but we rarely see the word adultery. And probably we don't even call it that. And why? Because adultery is a word straight out of the Bible. It is a biblical term, and it immediately brings our attention to the 10 Commandments, the divine prohibition, the nastiness, and the ungodliness of the act. And so when someone uses the word adultery today, it almost sounds like maybe sin is involved in some way. And of course, that's a no-no in our permissive, politically correct culture. Today, spouses might be unfaithful, people might have affairs, or they might have amours, or they might have chance meetings or rendezvous. They might be guilty of indiscretions, but folks rarely commit adultery. A woman might not even be offended if you accuse her of being unfaithful or accuse her of having an affair, but she would probably slap you in the face if you called her an adulteress. You see, even when we consider the physical act of adultery, even if we just go back to the letter of the law, the 7th commandment is being broken at an alarming rate. So now let's look at what Jesus does to the definition as he fulfills the law. Verse 28. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, obviously, Jesus is addressing men specifically here. Anyone who even looks at a woman with lust. Yet in our out in the open, out of the closet, non-sexist culture today, Jesus' words could be applied literally to women also. Women lusting after men, men lusting after women. Now the dictionary says that lust is an intense, obsessive, or unrestrained sexual craving. So even though Jesus' words are directed to men in this men-oriented society, it's just as true, especially today, that a woman can lust after a man. Craig Bloomberg's Matthew commentary, the New American Commentary, says this: these paragraphs do not specifically refer to a woman lusting after a man, only a man after a woman. But given the reciprocal nature of Jesus' teaching elsewhere, it is clearly implied. Nevertheless, men may well sin more often than women in this particular way because male sexual arousal comes primarily through sight. Jesus' teaching, much like the anti-pornography movement today, is greatly liberating for women. So what does it mean to look at a woman or to look at another person lustfully? At what point does the look become lust? I read where there was a man who was filing for a divorce, and he accused his wife of carrying on a virtual affair via her computer with a cyber sex partner who called himself the Weasel. Now, the wife's relationship with the man was never consummated, but her husband claimed that the pair had planned a real physical sexual encounter at a bread and breakfast. But the husband filed divorce papers that included dozens of email exchanges. You see, here are two people who never saw each other, but was lust involved? Clearly it was. There are certainly benefits to social media and electronic communication, but many times unfaithfulness in marriage has its origin this way. Malcolm Tolbert's little commentary on Matthew, Good News from Matthew, he says this: we need to understand that the problem is not our sexuality nor sexual feelings. No, those are God-given. He said the problem is in our basic attitude toward people. Lust causes us to treat persons as objects, as things. Love demands that we honor their personhood as sacred, not to be desecrated or cheapened in order to satisfy our sexual urges. And Dr. Herschel Hobbs, in his commentary, he makes no bones that he really appreciated the beauty of a woman. And he said, Jesus did not say that a man should not look at a woman to admire her beauty and grace. The idea in the Greek text is deliberately to look on a woman with a view of lusting after her. Craig Bloomberg again. Jesus is referring to the one who continues to look rather than just casting a passing glance. He is condemning lustful thoughts and actions, those involving an actual desire to have sexual relations with someone other than one's spouse. Yet despite the danger of over-applying this verse, an even greater danger is that of under-applying it. You see, lust is not just admiring another person's beauty. It's not even when thoughts and feelings of sex come into our mind. That's the way we are built. But it's when we begin to think of another person as strictly a sex object, cheapening a person of having value only to satisfy our sexual desires. That's what lust is. However, as Bloomberg has mentioned, there is a very fine line, and we would want to err on the side of over-applying, of widening the definition rather than under-applying it. So Jesus has stated that the sin of adultery begins with an inward thought, an inward desire, whether it results in the physical act or not. And since that is the place it begins, that is the place it needs to end. That is the place for bud nipping. Jesus confirmed that the physical act of adultery is sin, but he said so is the lustful thought of adultery. And so both are sin. And so some might argue, well, if I've thought it and that's a sin, well, then I might as well do it. Well, there's something wrong with that kind of thinking. You see, if the lustful thought is there, as we have defined it, if we are obsessed with gratifying our sexual urge with someone else's wife or husband, then the only thing that can prevent the physical act of adultery is either the lack of opportunity, that is, she says, get lost, oh buddy, or the fear of the consequences. You fear her big husband who is a police officer, or you fear breaking up your family. Now, of course, there is such a thing as Christian restraint, and that is a virtue. With the lust, there is sin. It's our personal sin. But when that lust translates into physical act, then someone else has joined us in our sin, and many lives are adversely affected. And the consequences are different. The consequences are greater. I don't think any woman has ever become pregnant or anyone has ever contracted a sexually transmitted disease from limiting their sin to a lustful thought. And now Jesus deals with the importance of keeping the law. Look at verse 29 with me. So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. An obsessive sexual desire, including the illicit satisfaction of that desire, is something that we can get caught up in. It's something that we can become enslaved by. Now, if you ever saw the recording of Dr. Dobson's interview with Ted Bundy, minutes before his execution in Florida's electric chair, you heard a man tell of being consumed by sex and pornography. It is addictive, and it leads to a path of destruction, and Jesus is rather blunt. It can lead your whole body straight into hell. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. To show what extremes a person should go to avoid being caught up in a life in bondage to illicit sex, Jesus uses a figure of speech. He uses hyperbole. He exaggerates just a wee little bit. He talks about what the doctors at MASH 4077 call meatball surgery. He says that if it will help you curb your illicit sexual urge, then gouge out your eye and throw it away, or cut off your hand and throw it away. Well, what is Jesus really saying here? Surely he would not approve of self-mutilation. Frank Stagg in the Broadman Bible Commentary says Jesus is saying that not only is sexual lust a form of adultery, but that the threat of lust is so strong and its danger so great that a price comparable to the removal of an eye or hand is not too great to pay as one seeks freedom from it. You know what a wild animal will do if he gets his foot or leg caught in a trap with no way out? He will gnaw that limb off because his survival instinct is dominant. He would rather have 3 legs than 4 legs and die. And I suspect, even though this is a gross thought, that a human being would do the same if placed in that same circumstances. In fact, I've read stories where that has happened. One commentary says Jesus told his disciples that a sane person would make the hard decisions needful to save his or her life to keep the body out of punishment. In the same manner, Jesus told his disciples that extreme discipline was necessary to protect the believer's spiritual life. Any conscientious, spiritually sane believer would deny himself or herself even the taste of sin that could result in the destruction of the marriage relationship. In verse 29, that term causes you to lust in the original language is a term from which we get the word scandal. It was the word for a trigger on a trap and can probably best be translated stumbling block. If we stumble in the area of sexual unfaithfulness, something probably caused us to stumble. And Jesus is saying, whatever that is and whatever the cost, get rid of it. Now that of course doesn't mean that we ourselves aren't fully accountable when we stumble. So Jesus speaks of plucking out an eye or cutting off a hand. He's talking about getting rid of body parts. But there are things today that cause us to lust that need to be plucked out and thrown away. Edelman's commentary is the eye or hand in this case may refer to an individual, a social circle, a certain form of recreation, or a so-called friend. If it is conducive to adultery, then eliminate it. Better lose a best friend than expose oneself to temptation. I thought about things like television, music, movies, magazines, the internet especially. Whatever it is that causes us to lust, we need to throw it away. Andy Stanley did such a great job with this concept in his sermon series on marital fidelity that he entitled Guardrails. He used as an analogy guardrails that are placed along the highway alongside a ravine or a gully. And if we were to hit one of those guardrails, it would cause quite a bit of damage to our car, but it protects that which is most valuable, that is our life and the lives of our passengers. In our culture today, and most practically, guardrails provide the same prevention as cutting off a hand or gouging out an eye, only in a positive way rather than a negative way. You see, married couples need to set up guardrails, barriers that when you bump up against them, it signals to you danger. There's danger on the other side. And when we hit a guardrail, that's not necessarily sin, but it's a signal to turn around and back away. You see, I would say that probably in most cases of unfaithfulness, not all, but most, the infidelity is not planned or intended. Most times, I don't think a husband or a wife wakes up and says, I think I'll go trolling today. I think I'll look for someone to have an affair with. I think I'll cheat on my wife and break up my family today. Most times it happens because guardrails are not put in place. And with nothing to signal danger, with nothing to bump up against, a casual conversation ends up with two people in bed together. Now here are a couple of very simple guardrails that Andy Stanley suggests. Here's the first one. Never get in a car alone with a person who is not your husband or your wife. And if you find yourself in this situation, that should ring out a very loud alarm. It's a guardrail. It's surely not a sin to be alone in a car with another man or woman, but it is a guardrail. It's a warning. My personal policy as pastor is I'm never alone with a woman unless she is old enough to be my mother. Here's the second one. Never share a meal alone with a person who is not your husband or wife, not even in public. Now, is there sin in sharing a meal with someone who is not your wife or husband? Absolutely not. But Andy Stanley says that in all the cases he has counseled, with couples that have been plagued by infidelity, he could only recall one time when the affair did not begin by sharing a meal together. You're in a group of people sharing a meal, and all of a sudden everybody leaves, and you and another married person of the opposite sex are there together. That should sound an alarm. That is a guardrail. One of the greatest examples of hand cutting and eye gouging, of guardrails, was an agreement that's been termed the Modesto Manifesto. Back in 1948, the Billy Graham evangelistic team met for a strategy session at a hotel in Modesto, California. There were 4 men, Cliff Barrows, Grady Wilson, Billy Graham, and George Beverly Shea. And these 4 men made a covenant, one that would ensure the success and survival of their ministry. What were the guardrails they put in place? Well, here are just a few. They would never set their own salaries. They would allow a board of Christian people to do that for them. They would always plan their evangelistic meetings with the support and cooperation of local churches. They would never divorce themselves from the church. Here's the third. They would never exaggerate their ministerial success. And listen to this one. They would never be alone with a woman not his wife. Now, these were guardrails that were set in place to protect certain elements of their ministry, including their marriages. And while many evangelists over the years have fallen because they got caught up in lust over women and lust over money, Billy Graham's reputation was never blemished, and he maintained credibility that he needed to proclaim the gospel. Regarding adultery, in our culture, violation of the letter of the law is rampant. And if that's the case, then violation of the spirit of the law is insurmountable. Jesus expands the commandment because a violation of the spirit of the law can lead to the violation of the letter of the law, which has greater, much more serious and dangerous consequences. That's Jesus' word regarding adultery. If we were to sum it up, we could say this: regarding adultery, don't do it. And whatever it costs to prevent it, be willing to pay it.